Well, you are listening to some of the activity at Cal Anderson Park from over the weekend. This is from Como TV, as 23 people were arrested after counter-protesting a Mayday USA rally, part of a conservative Christian group's national tour. Seattle Mayor Bruce Harrell and the Seattle City Council getting plenty of public pushback about this, as in, why was this rally allowed at Cal Anderson in the heart of Seattle's LGBTQ community in the first place? Plenty of questions about that, plus some questions about police hiring and how much it will cost on the council's docket this week, plus an ethics code issue that continues to heat up. Well, we are back in action this week on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel. The views expressed here are mine, and I'm joined by my co-host, David Croman, City Hall reporter for the Seattle Times. David, I got to ask, looks like our first 80-degree, or day of the year, I should say, coming up this week. What are you doing to celebrate?
I'm taking all the plastic off of my warm-loving plants so that they don't overheat, because
here we go.
Yeah, it's kind of intense.
Tis the season for sure. Well, thank you, David, as always, and thanks to everybody listening, especially thanks to those who are patrons of the show. You were able to get some patrons first content last week, you lucky devils, when I was talking to Hannah Krieg of The Burner. Everybody else, you want in on that? Subscribe on Patreon for as low as $5 per month. Even get a decal, pretty snazzy. We'll answer your questions on the show, too. Love to have you here on Seattle News, Views, and Brews. Also, a shout out to Converge Media. The video version of the podcast is on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, let's get going. Time for Right Here, Right Now. Well, in case you missed it, over the holiday weekend, a conservative Christian group, Mayday USA, held a prayer rally at Cal Anderson Park, they say in support of family values. Save our children, they say. Counter-protesters say Mayday is an anti-LGBTQ extremist group, and then the clash that followed, 23 of those counter-protesters were arrested. David, this was a pretty wild scene on Saturday, a major test for Seattle police who deployed the so-called less lethal weapons the council recently approved them to use. What did you make of this activity from over the weekend?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the perfect clash of First Amendment rights and sort of uncomfortable political dynamics, I guess you could say. You know, the fact of this group holding this rally in Cal Anderson Park, you know, there was some question of how it ended up being there in particular. Both sides say it shouldn't have been there, actually. But, you know, it just the fact that they were there sort of talking specifically about, you know, quote, freedom from same-sex attraction and sort of rejecting basically that transgender people exist, right where, you know, there's in the park name, Cal Anderson, you know, it's the first openly gay elected official in Washington. But, you know, I mean, the city is in some ways limited in what they could do in this situation. I mean, it's not their preferred speech, but it is protected speech. You know, we could get into that side of it versus sort of the police response side as well, which is how did they do under their new less lethal weapons law.
Yeah, did you get a feel for that at all? I mean, I know there are a number of arrests, and I know they deployed some of these weapons, it sounds like.
Yeah, I wasn't there. They didn't use blast balls. That was kind of the big contention around that piece of legislation. They didn't use tear gas either. Those are the two pieces that would have required mayoral approval. Mm-hmm. They did appear to have used pepper spray. You know, I mean, I wasn't there at the time, and even if you're there, it's sort of hard to tell exactly, you know, the narrative of these protests is sort of hard to tease out. Police say that it was started by counter-protesters throwing things at the police. Some people were there say they didn't see anything like that. You know, there's some contention that the rally was held there specifically to create the circumstances for these kinds of clashes. The organizers deny that. So this question of who is at fault and how was it handled is something that I'm sure will be, you know, discussed for a while to come. But, you know, not being there at the time, I don't have any sort of firsthand knowledge of exactly how it unfolded.
Yeah, I got it. I wasn't there either. And I should point out we are recording this podcast before another Mayday rally planned for Tuesday evening at City Hall. But I was trying to figure out how the mayor was positioning himself on this, because right after this happened, Mayor Harrell spoke out. He had a statement that said, Mayday USA, this is a far-right rally intended to provoke a reaction by promoting beliefs that are inherently opposed to our city's values. Part of that, a quote from him. He said he supports First Amendment rules, but also said he would direct the Parks Department to review all the circumstances of this application for this rally to figure out if there are any alternatives or adjustments that could have been pursued. Mayday USA folks came back and said to KTTH the mayor was, quote, full of crap. I just wanted to figure out how this works too, because this feels like kind of a lose-lose situation for the mayor and the city council too.
Yeah, because the city is all but obligated to grant this group a permit in this case. Parks and sidewalks are kind of ground zero for First Amendment rights. They're public space. The city cannot say that they don't like something and therefore will not grant a permit to be there. But there's another piece, which is they have some control over the time and manner in which
Yeah.
each is expressed. And so, what happened here is this group for a long time had been saying that they were going to do this rally, quote, in Pike's Place. Of course, not the correct way to say it. And,
Correct.
and
Yeah,
actually,
got it.
they weren't even going to do it in Pike Place. They wanted to do it on this street on Pike Street between First and Second. That
Yes.
They went to the city's special events office and asked to do this, and they were denied because the events office said, there's no way we can accommodate a rally on the street. It's going to disrupt traffic. But go to the Parks Department, put your application in there. Parks Department came back, said, here are the parks we have open. We think Cal Anderson or South Lake Union Park are the ones that can accommodate your rally. The protesters or the rally organizers chose Cal Anderson Park. And that's kind of how it unfolded. And so, once it got to that point where they're putting in an application for Cal Anderson, the city doesn't really have a leverage or reason to deny them that permit other than we think you're there to provoke a response, which
Right.
is in fact a constitutionally protected thing. If the organizers had said, we are there to smash a bunch of windows and beat up gay people or whatever, they could have denied it. But they're not saying they're there to pray. And they say they're not there to provoke anything. You can quibble with what they're saying, but the First Amendment protects that. The First Amendment protected Nazis rallying in a predominantly Jewish town. The First Amendment certainly protects Christians holding a rally in Cal Anderson Park. That's not to say that that's not a deeply uncomfortable thing for everybody involved. And, I think it's certainly fine to ask why did these organizers want to go there instead of South Lake Union Park, which also could have worked for them.
Sure.
Probably would not have elicited the same kind of response. But, there's, I think the city would be in a lot more legal trouble if they had denied that permit rather than having granted it.
Fair. I just wonder what happens because it sounds like in August there's a similar event on the docket that is supposed to be happening at Cal Anderson Park. Does the city move it, or what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the city could come up with reasons to move it, I suppose, but it couldn't. They couldn't be grounded in the beliefs of the people doing the rally. And that's tough because now they're on the record saying we're going to review this. There's lots of comments just now in the city council about what the city believes, and that's all fine and good. But as a justification for sort of moving it, I'm not a law professor here, but I think doing it purely because the city isn't going to like what these people have to say puts them into tricky territory. Even if the motivations of that group are explicitly to rile up tensions and cause this kind of fight, and we see this tested over and over. The ACLU protected. Has defended the ACLU defended Nazis in Illinois. The ACLU defended Nazis in Virginia because the argument from a lot of people is, the First Amendment and free speech rights are more important than the sort of one-off uncomfortable situations that you get in here. The mayor says he's going to review this process. I don't know where that leads. And to your point about this one particular event, maybe the city realizes they have a different fair happening that same day, that same time, but now there's a sort of record of frustration on the part of city officials with this being there. And so, it could be difficult to defend if they want to move it.
Yeah, a very challenging course ahead for the mayor, certainly. We'll keep an eye on that over the summertime. I did want to continue with the topic of police because there was an interesting presentation Tuesday morning in the Public Safety Committee focusing on what's next with police hiring. So with all the news touted by the council about hiring more officers, the city's own research says while it's expecting to increase hires by 34 officers, there's a chance it could add as many as 76 net new officers. And SPD really isn't funded for that many hires. David, I thought this was a pretty eye-opening budget reveal. What did you make of that?
It's interesting. For the last few years, SPD has been kind of overfunded in a way. Not a political statement, but like they have funding for hires that they do not end up making, and so there's leftover funding there. Interesting that they find themselves in this position now. Yeah. I don't know. Curious to hear your thoughts too.
Yeah, no, it's one of these deals where I wonder what happens in a tight tight budget year with this, just because this is a situation we haven't been in before for the police, and I'm not sure if the council even knew that their increased pay for police, et cetera, would lead to such a unprecedented, really, influx of officers here. So I guess I was just looking at it from the potential strain on the budget and what that would mean.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is, I keep saying this. I mean, there's some fringe on the edge reasons why maybe recruitment has improved. I don't want to totally discount that. For my money, it's about the money.
Dollars, yeah.
That they're now the best paid in the state. Good signing bonuses. A lot of people, sort of an underappreciated piece of this actually too, is that a lot of the officers who left the SPD to go somewhere else have probably been away long enough now that they can come back and get a signing bonus to return.
Oh, geez. So, wow. I didn't even think about that. Sure.
They would have collected 2 signing bonuses at this point, which is, I mean, that's the policies of these cities, is that they're okay with that. So, yeah, I mean, it's an expensive thing what they're doing, no doubt about that. And I'm sure, I think lots of people who have other priorities that are maybe going to get squeezed in the upcoming budget are going to be happy to point that out. The Seattle Police Department is probably proving to be more expensive, but it is what this current city hall ran on to hire more officers. So I think they're probably going to find the money to pay for it.
Last little piece with this, I wanted to look a little bit more closely at overtime hours, which were definitely an issue with the Seattle Police Department over the past. There were some officers that were making twice their salary in overtime, and there was a lot of concern about this. As it stands right now, the report that was shown on Tuesday morning showed that SPD spent about 20% of its overtime budget through the first quarter. That does not include what happened at Cal Anderson, of course, or any of the other rallies that are expected here, or what might happen during the summer when the beginning of the World Cup is happening here. That Team World Cup action is going to be happening. I'm sure there's going to be a lot more officers out on the street. I just wanted to touch on this overtime budget, David. Do you think that's going to turn into a political issue this fall? It's really hard to predict. Even the city's bean counters on Tuesday morning were talking about that.
Yeah, this always feels like an issue where when the bill comes due, we hear a lot of frustration from city council, thinking particularly with the progressive city council before. They kind of get in this position where the police would say, here's what we spend on overtime. We kind of need more money to cover our bills. And everyone grumbles and gets frustrated and says, we're going to make sure you don't do this again, but here's the money, to cover it. And then half of city council leaves and we get a new city council and back in the situation again. So, there's a short-term memory when it comes to these sorts of things. It seems like there's a perennial conversation around getting overtime under control. I think that conversation gets a little more serious as hiring improves, because the police department has always had a pretty good excuse for why they're spending so much on overtime, which is that they're understaffed. I don't know if that covers some of these extreme examples that you mentioned where people are working as many overtime hours as they are regular hours. The math starts to get a little hard to figure out how that works. But I think on a broad level, certainly that would be something that I think the council should be a little more critical of as staffing perhaps eases a little bit.
Yeah. Something to keep an eye on there. Thank you for that, David. All right, coming up, an issue about the city council's ethics code that is nowhere near going away. The clash on the council and with the mayor that's unfolding here. David's done a nice deep dive on this story. We're going to look at it next on Now Hear This. So as we've been reporting on the podcast over the past few weeks, the city council's in a bit of a difficult situation when it comes to changing its ethical code. The governance committee voted 2-0 last week with 3 abstentions on revising the city's ethics code to allow members to vote on matters in which they have a financial interest if they make a public disclosure. That's a change from the current practice requiring council members to recuse themselves in these situations. And the clash between the council is palpable up on the dais. Take a listen.
Really what we're trying to look at here is a way to basically make some adjustment to the ethics law to allow it to work better. It has not been working well.
This is not the moment we should be weakening our city's code of ethics. In fact, given the fragile national environment, I'd go as far to say that this is the worst possible timing for this.
That's Councilmember Kathy Moore and Councilmember Alexis Mercedes Rink with some very different opinions on this issue here. And as you've reported, David, I thought this was interesting. The mayor has actually weighed in opposition to this legislation. So even if the council did pass this, they'd have to have 6 votes to make sure that this change to the ethics code that they're looking for is veto-proof. I just wanted to look at the math first. Does the council have the votes? What do you think?
I genuinely don't know. I mean, we know that there are two people opposed. That's Strauss and Rink. They've been pretty clear about that. Of course, Moore is in favor, and Solomon and Rivera, excuse me, voted for this bill in committee. I thought it was very interesting that it had 3 abstentions. That's a lot of abstentions for a 5-person committee. I think Nelson, she said something about how she wants to consider all the amendments before she signs off on it.
Right.
I would guess Nelson has pushed for this in behind the scenes, so I would guess she's a yes vote. But I do think that Hollingsworth and Kettle are genuine question marks. I actually ran into Kettle before the council meeting last week, and I asked him, how are you going to vote? And at the time, he said, I don't know. He ended up abstaining, which I guess confirms that.
That's what he talked to me about on the Council Edition show a couple of weeks ago. Keep going,
And so, they can't lose Kettle and Hollingsworth. We haven't heard anything from Saka. I don't know where he's at on this. Because what you said, the mayor is he hasn't said, I'm going to veto this, but you don't come out and say, I oppose this in such clear terms and then not veto it.
Right.
So they really have to come at this with a pretty strong majority. I would think even passing this with a slim 6 votes doesn't look great for them. This is a council that likes to preach unanimity as best as they can. And so
not here.
I think it puts them in a pretty tough situation with this. And politically, this is a tough vote. I think the substance of it is debate worthy. I think that there are fairly good faith arguments on both sides, actually.
Yeah.
But the politics of this, which is it's hard to have a headline about it that doesn't say something on the lines of this is lowering the city's ethics standards.
Yeah.
You can argue the ethics standards were too high before. That's fine. But it is a lowering of the ethics standards. And we're coming up on an election year. The mayor understands that. I think that's why he's coming across so strongly against it. It's a tough political time to take these votes.
And it's a very tough political time, too, because we're right on the brink of potentially seeing the council change some of their landlord-tenant laws. I know Kathy Moore on the council says, oh, no, there's no connection, but that's just not really how it's coming across to a lot of critics. David, I know we've talked about this before, but that timing issue in particular is really starting to enter the conversation a lot more. I know we've heard a lot of protesters talking about it in public comment here, the connection between this ethics vote and what the council could say with regard to landlord-tenant laws. Some thoughts about the timing here.
Yeah, I mean, Kathy Moore can say whatever she wants about the timing, but there is a connection. I mean, it's even if it was not intentional, which I find a little hard to believe, but even if not intentional, this vote will have an effect on that vote, if that vote ever comes forward. Because 2 members, Maritza Rivera and Mark Solomon, are landlords. And so they were under the current city rules. And Wayne Barnett was pretty clear about this. Under the current city rules, they would not be able to vote on a landlord-tenant regulation. And so you're working with a 6-member council, probably 2 of them are going to be hostile to changes. That puts you down to 5 votes. You've got swing votes in Hollingsworth. And, the math gets tricky there without changes to this. So the timing couldn't be purely coincidental, but there is a direct connection between the two. I think there's a lot of nuance being missed about who is pushing for that landlord-tenant bill, which in a lot of ways is predominantly nonprofit affordable housing developers.
Right.
There's a lot to be said about that whole world, and we will say that. But whether Kathy Moore wants it to be there or not, there is a direct nexus between these 2 bills.
Yeah, so interested to see how that plays out. We're waiting to see a full council vote on that. We'll keep you posted when that news comes through. Plenty of other activity on the council this week, I should point out. They're moving on the Families Education Preschool and Promise Levy. They're trying to push that levy along. Also, the plan to rebuild Memorial Stadium at Seattle Center, working with the public schools on that one. Interested to see how that's all going to pan out. But I really wanted to look at this measure the full council is considering this week, a resolution to state that Seattle is a welcoming city. So this would be on top of the Welcoming City Ordinance the council passed in March, meant to strengthen protections from harmful federal actions, etc., specifically for people seeking reproductive health care and gender-affirming treatment. But this new situation here includes a commitment to possibly fund the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs with $300,000 to respond to emerging legal needs, as the council puts it, when it comes to immigrant enforcement. David, this is one of the few times I've actually seen a dollar sign assigned to this issue. What do you make of this resolution?
Yeah, it's we saw kind of an interesting tension. Tension's maybe an overstatement, but a little bit of a tension in council just now, which is they all support the goals of this resolution. And I do think the rally over the weekend kind of puts a finer point on on their statements. Councilmember Hollingsworth had some pretty powerful things to say as somebody who's gay and black and represents that district. But I think it was Councilmember Rivera said, I support the intentions behind this, but not the money that we're talking about. Which isn't to say it's a lot of money, but it is to say that a lot of this council is going to be very hesitant to put obligations on money before they've started the official budgeting process. Yep. Because that's going to be a really intense fight. And, we see this on the council sometimes where, I'm thinking of Councilmember Morales had a bill a year or two ago around sidewalks, sort of trying to obligate certain city funds to pay for sidewalks. So we see this every now and then where there is sort of council member priorities that come out just before the budget that direct funding toward their priorities. And it's, I'm making this sound a little more bad faith than it actually is, but it does have the effect of sidestepping the more intense budget fights that happen during budget season if you can kind of write in some of this obligation in advance.
Right.
Which isn't to say that it's not a valid priority and important to this council. I think it is. There is just like a little bit of friction there because I think certain council members see this as Councilmember Rink kind of taking some of the budget capacity in advance of what are going to be fairly intense fights between them come budget season.
Yeah, a non-binding resolution. But when you start putting dollar figures out there, you're absolutely right. That's when council members' ears start pricking up. And I guess just to wrap up on this, very tough to know where the Trump administration is going to focus its attention next. But does a measure like this put Seattle even more in the sights of President Trump? Is that even possible? How do you see that part of it?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, because it's a reaffirmation. It's not like this is doing really anything that the city already doesn't already do. I do wonder. I mean, this is pure speculation on my part. I do wonder if the rally over the weekend catches the eye of the Trump administration. I think there are probably people here who have connections to the Trump administration in a way that might make the city a little. So, for my money, that has a more likely possibility of catching the attention of the Trump administration than this particular resolution does. But we'll see.
Yeah, I know. One of those times you got to look at the Fox News website and see what's happening. It's going to be an interesting next few days there. All right. Well, coming up next, the council has approved a measure we've discussed over the past few weeks to comply with House Bill 1110, the so-called missing middle bill to encourage the buildings of more duplexes, quadplexes. We'll take a closer look at what the council actually did and what effect this will have. Coming up on What's Next. David, I appreciated the piece you wrote for the Seattle Times last week about the housing plan the city council just approved to add more density to the city. The full council basically had to pass it this week just to make a June 30th deadline set by the state. But I was really struck by the fact that after all the fighting about this measure, does it add enough housing? Does it threaten neighborhoods? Is it okay with trees? This is still temporary, right? Can you break that down?
Yes, it's still temporary, which means we have a lot of these conversations all over again, basically starting next week. Yeah, it's temporary because for a few reasons. One, the mayor's office was slow to submit their plan, so they were behind schedule to start. And then these appeals to the hearing examiner came up, which the city can't pass legislation when there's an open hearing. All of those have been dismissed. One of them, at least one of them, also has now been dismissed by a King County Superior Court judge, which means the city could theoretically pass permanent legislation at this point, but they're saying that basically they are behind the ball. They're behind schedule because of those appeals. I think there's an argument to be made that they could have moved a little more quickly and gotten the permanent piece passed. And now they're going to have to take a lot of time in the next few months to do it all over again.
Yeah.
I also think at the same time there's a recognition that there's going to be some controversial pieces of their permanent plan here.
Right.
There's not much they can do around duplexes and triplexes and quadplexes and sixplexes because that's now mandated by the state. But this proposal for the neighborhood centers is not mandated by the state. And so that's going to be kind of an intense fight on the city level. I think they just didn't want to have that in a compacted time frame. I think some of the members are probably skeptical of the plan. So that's where I think the big fight over the next few months is going to be, is around those neighborhood centers.
Yeah, explain what a neighborhood center is and why people might be pushing back about it.
Yeah, so it's these 30 proposed centers around the city, and these are places that are sort of mini commerce hubs already. So Maple Leaf and Magnolia and Madison Valley. Places that have little collections of businesses, but are zoned as if they're residential mostly. And so these proposals, it's a pretty small area. It's like 800 feet in every direction, would basically be allowed to have small apartment buildings near them.
Yes.
That isn't mandated by the state, like I said. And so this becomes a purely city fight. And we're talking about specific neighborhoods, and specific neighborhoods tend to have powerful organizing forces.
Oh, yeah.
So we've already seen some pushback from a few of these neighborhoods saying, the city hasn't done enough kind of on the ground work here. So, I think that, and already, according to the urbanists, the mayor's office has started to kind of change some of their proposed boundaries on this and whittled some of them down. I think there's going to be big fights trying to whittle down or change some of these.
Yeah, and I know you there was a great coda, I guess, to your piece there where you were talking with Jessica Bateman, who is the state senator who has been working so hard on this. She's down in the Olympia area, and she was really one of the main minds behind House Bill 1110. But when you see that, okay, we're going to tweak this, the city is saying we're going to tweak this, maybe we're going to change how much yard setback people need to have or whatever. It almost sounded to me like what you heard from Senator Bateman was this idea that, hey, we might need to go back as a state and kind of revisit what these cities are doing just to make sure they're actually doing what we passed in these different bills in Olympia.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a thing in Olympia, is because it was a big step to make these mandates of how much housing needs to be built in cities. But there was always this question of what would be, how the cities would receive that and kind of what was open for them. And I think part of the plan was always to kind of see how cities reacted. And then if that was not to the state legislators' liking, they would come back and kind of put more stringent requirements on them. She has a lot of political power here because it is not, unlike, say, something like rent control, this is a pretty broadly agreed upon principle in Olympia that the state needs more housing supply. So I wouldn't be surprised if she looks at Seattle in particular. I know she's been frustrated by the conversations around yards, like you said, and, finds ways that they can kind of even tighten that up a little bit and restrict what Seattle's, allowed to do even more than what they have.
Yeah, I'm so interested to see what happens there. And I do need to wrap up with you, though. And I noticed something earlier this week, David, in one of your recent baseball posts, which are always great to see. There was a theory I wanted to ask you about. So you got Cal Raleigh, I should say, Mariners catcher, strong start to the season, near tops in league in home runs. His nickname is Big Dumper, as many people know, referring to the size of his rear end, apparently a big source of his power. You mentioned something about Samson and his hair. So do you mean there's somehow like a direct statistical connection between the circumference of Cal Raleigh's butt and his home run totals? What sort of mathematical equation does that even look like? What's going on here?
Well, he's just having his best year by far. And I saw a home run video recently, and I don't want to get too explicit here, but just thought his dumper was looking particularly big. And so it made
too hot for the podcast. Look out. Okay. Yeah.
And so it made me think maybe there's a connection there. The larger his dumper gets, the more powerful he becomes.
2 pi r, I think, was circumference. We're going to have to do some extra work on that one. But, David, I can't wait to see some more home runs from Cal Raleigh, and I can't wait to talk about that more with you. I appreciate you being with me, as always. I appreciate everybody listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Thanks again to patrons who support the show. Susie and Jake, thanks to you for joining in. Would love to see pledges from anyone and everyone, starting at just $5 per month on Patreon. That really helps support the show and would be greatly appreciated. You can hear this podcast on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen. We are there. Thanks for watching on Converge Media, too. See you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2025.